So speaking this for myself, this is the first time I've been physically in a church in over a year. So I'm delighted that it's here. And grateful to one and all for having me. Will you join me in prayer? Good and gracious God, be with us this morning as we gather together as citizens of democracy to try and sort out what your will is for the great decisions that face us as a country and that face us as individual Christians in that country. Grant us the wisdom to understand your will and encourage the energy to act on it as best we can as disciples of your Son, Jesus Christ. In Jesus' name we pray. So the agenda that Dave and I negotiated extensively calls for a discussion of Afghanistan this week, and then next week we'll pivot to larger issues of the state of democracy. But it seems to make sense to start with Afghanistan, partly because you guys have heard about Afghanistan from the past, apologies, but because it's now back in the news for the first time in a long time. I've often thought it striking, actually, that democracy waging war can do it almost invisibly, for as long as that's been the case here. But because the Biden administration announced last month that we were going to withdraw completely from the country, there's been this sudden spike in public attention and news media coverage. And so it seems to me it makes sense to revisit the issues of that war in that country in light of that. And there are at least two tacks to this that I want to take this morning. One is the immediate question: did the Biden administration decide rightly when they made the decision to withdraw completely? My own view is no, and I'll spend a little bit of time explaining why I think that decision was a mistake. But a lot of the public attention that's going on is this kind of valedictory quality at this point. I mean, a lot of backwards looks at a 20-year-long war and trying to figure out what, if anything, it means for America going forward, for Afghanistan looking backwards. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this larger question. What does this war mean? And what, if anything, should we learn from it? So to do any of that, it's kind of obligatory. As a college professor, I'm required by licensing requirements to begin with a larger question of our interest in state economy. I do this every time, right? So you can do as well as I can this time. But it's mandatory, right? Dave would be upset with me if I didn't say very. Well, I'm not upsetting Dave is one of my primary goals. So just very briefly, after all, most Americans don't think there's any good reason to be at all. So is there? I think there is. The problem is it's not like World War III. We have interests, they're real, but they're limited. So the interests that we have in the country are first of all, kind of the broad interests we have anywhere in the world in human rights, prosperity, minority rights, the ability of women to function in a society. We aspire to those things for Afghanistan. We aspire to those things anywhere in the world, so surely we win Afghanistan as well. That has not been primary in the waging of war there. Normally we pursue this agenda that finds through diplomatic and economic and sort of military means. The case for waging war there, or at the moment assisting the Afghans in waging war there, is largely twofold. That Afghanistan not become a base by which Al-Qaeda can attack us or our allies, and Afghanistan not become a base with destabilizing regions in its past. But it's the only part of the region where Afghan stability works is terribly. I've argued in the past, you've heard me make a case that Al-Qaeda could, of course, return to Afghanistan. They can return to all sorts of places as well. There's nothing particularly unique about Afghanistan. If you think it's important to be there, it's because of its effect on the region, and especially its effect on a nuclear arms. If the Afghan government collapses, and you get what's probably not going to happen, some sort of Taliban restoration, but what probably will happen, chronic, ongoing 1990s-style, multi-sided civil warfare in the country. That's a massive source of instability. On the doorstep of a country that's waging its own civil war, Pakistan has a large and growing nuclear arsenal. If Afghan instability catalyzes government collapse in Pakistan, the Pakistani nuclear arsenal breaches containment, And you run a non-trivial risk of nuclear weapons use by terrorists, either in the region or in the United States. That's a real U.S. national security interest. There is a reason to be in Afghanistan. That's the primary. But the problem is lots of things would have to go bad between now and then in order for that worst case to be realized. The government in Afghanistan would have to collapse. I think that's very likely at this point. But that would have to catalyze state collapse in Pakistan. That's less likely. Terrorists within Pakistan would have to get their hands on some of these released nuclear weapons. Moderately likely. They'd have to choose to use them against the United States. Moderately likely. You work through all the compound probabilities. And state collapse in Afghanistan isn't 90% likely to produce a mushroom cloud over Times Square. It's smaller than that. But if it happens, it would be really, really bad. So what you're left with is interests that are real, limited, that don't look like the Cold War with the Soviet Union or World War II responses, but that are hard to walk away from. And that's given rise to this whole torture, back and forth, Hamlet-like history of U.S. policy in Afghanistan, which brings us to the moment and the question of the withdrawal of the 2,500-ish officially designated U.S. soldiers out of the country. I said a minute ago, I thought that was a mistake. Why? I mean, how could 2,500 Americans possibly make a difference anywhere? We had 100,000 soldiers there in 2011. We didn't win the war. How can 2,500 make any difference? And the case for why they make a difference and why they should stay there is not primarily because their military presence or absence makes a huge difference in the conduct of the war. They contribute something militarily. Mostly they contribute airstrikes. The Afghan National Army and police are hard-pressed and depend heavily on U.S. air power to sustain their positions. That air power will go away when the U.S. presence goes away. We may or may not be able to fly some long-distance air support from bases way outside Afghanistan. It's not clear whether the administration wants to do that. It's physically possible that the tempo of airstrikes would go way down. The airstrikes do matter so much. We train and advise Afghan hosted forward commanders. We'll stop doing that when our troops go home. That, in my view, has very little effect on the ground. The issue for me is not the military contribution of 2,500 Americans. That's small. It's the political contribution of 2,500 Americans. At this point, there are only two plausible long-term outcomes in Afghanistan. Either the government collapses and we get to run the social science experiment and switch on, right? See where there are all these bad things happen in training, and you end up with terrorist use of nuclear weapons, unlikely but not impossible. The other long-term outcome is a negotiated settlement of the war, in which some sort of compromise peace deal is reached. There are talks ongoing in Doha, Qatar, between the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan. They're trying to reach some sort of negotiated settlement to end the war. For all sorts of reasons, hard, realist U.S. national security interest reasons, like preventing terrorist use of nuclear weapons, or the broader penumbra of U.S. aspirations for human rights and human thriving in the world that I talked about earlier, which as Christians ought to matter to us. Right? I've said it before in this group, and I'll say it again. I really don't think God cares whose passport somebody carries. Right? The suffering of an Afghan matters to God as much as the suffering of Pennsylvania, or New York, or Texas. Right? There are issues about the ability of the United States to eradicate suffering. We can't do it everywhere. But we do have a marginal influence on it in some parts of the world more than others. We have a marginal influence on it in Afghanistan at the moment that is more than marginal because of our potential catalytic role of bringing about a negotiated settlement to the war. I'm distraught by the way this issue is handled in the American public square right now, this sort of momentary spike of attention returning to Afghanistan. Public debate. Almost nobody talks about the negotiations. Lots and lots of people who favor withdrawal and are fond of the administration's policy on this have talked about how impossible it is to win the war in Afghanistan. That's not the point. It wasn't even the point back in 2011. Well, this is a larger meaning of the war today. The point is, can we or can we not get a negotiated settlement that preserves the core interests I talked about a minute ago and stops the war? So that the shooting stops, which would not only secure American national security interests, it would also reduce radically the suffering in Afghanistan. If we could get the fighting stuff. People talk about the administration ending the war in Afghanistan. Obviously, the administration didn't end the war in Afghanistan. The administration is ending the U.S. role. The war is going to go on. By all accounts, the war is actually getting more intense right now in Afghanistan. You want the shooting to stop, and you want the suffering to end, and you want the risks of American national security interests to diminish. The way to do that is negotiate a settlement of the war. And that brings us to the role of these 2,500 Americans actually playing. They were a bargaining chip. There are two principal political roles that these 2,500 uniformed Americans are currently playing in Afghanistan. The first and most important one is the Taliban want them out. We don't have a lot of leverage in these negotiations. Once upon a time we did. We had 100,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. We were spending $100 billion a year. We had real leverage. But we weren't interested in negotiating back then. Now we've reduced massively what we can offer the Taliban and what we can threaten the Taliban with. At this, if you want a settlement, if you want negotiations to actually end the war, you need some leverage with the other side. Unless they're just prepared to surrender outright, which we may with the government of Afghanistan tomorrow. The only two sources of leverage we have right now that are worth anything to Taliban are the true presence, which they badly want out, and the promise of future aid. We just unilaterally gave away one of the two in exchange for essentially nothing. This is mostly the Trump administration's doing rather than the Biden administration. About a year ago, and a little more, the Trump administration negotiated a deal, if you want to call it that, with the Taliban, in which we agreed to withdraw by May 1 in exchange for the Taliban doing several things that the Taliban basically decided not to do. Right? The Taliban agreed to end their relationship with Al-Qaeda, stop shooting at us, which they weren't doing anyway at the time, actually, and start negotiations with the Afghan government within a month of signing the agreement. They dragged their feet on negotiations with the Afghan government. It took more like 6 months rather than a month. But at least it started there. More consequentially, the U.S. intelligence communities concluded that they had not, in fact, worked with Al-Qaeda. On the other hand, we are pretty much going to do what we obligated ourselves to do. We're going to get all the way out. That's one of our two sources of leverage out the door. Now, if you think the talks are just hopeless, but you think there's no prospect these situations going anymore, then you can make a rational case for saying, well, if it's going to end badly anyway, let's at least have it end badly less expensive. Let's at least cut the American expenditures. And we'll bring the troops home. That's not what the administration is saying. The administration is continuing negotiations. Moreover, the administration is continuing to spend lots of American dollars supporting the Afghan military. At the moment, we spend it on the Afghan military, we go on our own soldiers. 2,500 U.S. soldiers in the war zone cost on average about $2.5 billion a year. We spend about $4 or $5 billion a year on the Afghan military. We're continuing to do that. Right? If you think the negotiations have some chance of succeeding, it makes sense to spend that money. But then you should be doing whatever you can do to have them actually succeed. Which means keep the troops there until and unless we get a settlement. Offer to bring every last American home when there's a deal. Right? I do not favor an ongoing American military presence in Afghanistan unless the new Afghan government after the settlement talks asks us to. I'm in favor of withdrawing it as a condition of a negotiated settlement that ends the war and stops the killing. Instead, what the administration has done is they've withdrawn without a settlement. But they haven't left the talks, and they continue to spend money in support of the talks. This makes very little sense to me. The cost of the U.S. presence, military presence in Afghanistan right now is a rounding error defense budget. We spend less than 0.3% of the defense budget on almost 2,500 soldiers in Afghanistan. If you're serious about this enterprise at all, and you think there's some chance for a deal, in exchange for cutting the defense budget by 0.3%, you just give away half of it. Right? I just find this a head-pounding, hard to understand choice by an administration whose choices I'm generally very sympathetic to. I think this was a mistake. I would rather we keep that small presence there and try and get a negotiated settlement. So anyway, I'm not very happy with what we've got. I think the odds at the moment are overwhelmingly that there will be no settlement in the government collapse. Maybe soon, maybe later, but I think eventually we're going to run a social science experiment here and see what happens. I would prefer we don't do that. Given all that, most of the conversation about the war in the public square at the moment is not pro, con, withdraw, not withdraw. It's this kind of longer view. What has this 20-year-long experience told us about either war in general, or American strategy, or other things? And one of the more prominent arguments in this kind of valedictory conversations happening in the country at the moment is the never again school. And the never again school basically argues you can't win with this counterinsurgency force. And what we ought to do is stop fighting. And what we ought to do is go back to winning wars. Right? One of the good old days, we could fight wars, win them decisively, destroy the enemy, and then goodness and all happy things ensue.
Puppy dogs.
Sorry.
Puppy dogs.
And you get puppy dogs. We have it. Don't forget that. Obviously, from the pejorative way of phrasing this, I don't buy that argument. And I don't buy that argument for a variety of reasons, mostly because my personal favorite dead white male Prussian, Karl von Clausewitz, doesn't like that argument. Right, so Karl von Clausewitz, famous 19th century Prussian military philosopher, and the patron saint of the U.S. military theory, right? There's a bust of Clausewitz in all of U.S. Army Corps College, and the students all encouraged Clausewitz statue in response to academic year. Clausewitz argued that war is an extension of politics by all means, which means that war is a means to ends that are political. Which means the point of this is you're going to kill people and destroy things in the name of the state. Christian, not Christian. You're doing it because you're trying to create a political outcome that you couldn't have gotten without all the killing and the destruction and assets. And you don't get a political outcome just by destroying an opponent's military. This kind of decisive war fighting that so many Americans now think it should be substituted with this nasty crime. Long, frustrating counterinsurgency sorts of things. If that worked, we would have happiness, peace, virtue, and goodness in both Afghanistan and in Iraq right now, because we destroyed both countries' militaries as thoroughly as you could destroy them in 2001 and 2003, respectively. If you get nice, clean, quick, decisive wins by destroying the enemy military, we won both of these wars a long time ago, and yet obviously they are not won. They're not won because the other side, after all their tanks got holes in them and caught on fire, and after the uniformed soldiers ditched the uniforms and donned civilian clothing, decided that they weren't happy with the political outcome that was the Americans preferred at that point, and they decided to keep fighting. Just not with tanks. If we cared enough about the political outcome in either of these countries to start the process of killing people and destroying things in the first place, The only reason, justifiable reason for doing it is because we wanted a political outcome in these two places that met the U.S. national security interests I was talking about earlier. The terrorists not use these territories to attack us or others, and that the region not get destabilized. We care about the region in Afghanistan because the Pakistanis have nuclear weapons. We care about the region in Iraq because the Persian Gulf is important to the world economy. You can't just blow up a military, bug out, declare victory, and then decide that everything's good. That's not our decision to make. That's a decision made by the people we were shooting at before, and whether they're satisfied with what the result is or not. If they're not satisfied with what the result is, the war just goes on. And if we weren't going to secure our interests in the end, why start? Why invade Afghanistan? Why invade Iraq? The moral of the story I draw from this is not that the United States needs to go back to 1940s style decisive warfare. I think that's a chimera. I don't think that solution exists. I think the moral that comes from this is we should all understand war more the way Clausewitz did. And the way the American military claims to, then forgets about, which is it's about politics. And that in turn means you should start negotiating almost immediately. Because negotiated settlements are the way wars actually end. That's even true for World War II. Right? The favorite poster child example of the let's win decisively and let's stop waging destroying your all counterinsurgency stalemates argument. Right? They all point to World War II as a case study of how destroying the enemy military decisively worked. How did World War II actually end? Well, in both cases, Germany and Japan, there was a compromise settlement that actually stopped the shooting. The German government that replaced Hitler signed a document that ordered their troops to stand down and stop shooting. There were hundreds of thousands of uniformed, armed German soldiers in the field and continuing to shoot at Allied soldiers when that surrender was announced. They could have kept on fighting. The U.S. High Command in 1945 was worried that they would. There were all sorts of plans floating around the Nazi German hierarchy for waging an insurgency in Germany and creating something that would look a lot like Afghanistan today. It didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? It didn't happen because the German government that replaced Hitler decided it wasn't in their political interest. They preferred peace on the terms that were being offered. After all, we didn't just enslave the population of Germany in 1946. We didn't disassemble German industry to ship it all back to the United States. We didn't kill off every German who had been associated with the Nazi Party. We offered them essentially a tacit peace deal that said, we aren't going to do all these nasty things to you. How about if you stop shooting at us? They said, it works for us, war ends. Even in the Pacific, we dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan. This sure looks like a decisive military outcome. And yet the United States backed off one of its principal war aims in 1945 in the Pacific to get the war in. Until the very end of the war, we were holding out for the argument that the Japanese emperor had to be replaced. No emperor. And then we withdrew those terms. There is an emperor in Japan today, as we speak. There was a tacit negotiation with Imperial Japan, in which we said, we're not going to announce this as a negotiation, right? But be aware that if you will stop shooting, we will not arrest the emperor. And then after 2 atom bombs, the Japanese agreed, and they laid down bombs. But they had hundreds of thousands of soldiers still in the field fighting. They could have kept going in guerrilla war. Isolated individuals who could get the word did. There were Japanese soldiers fighting in the Philippines for decades after 1945 because they just didn't get the word that the emperor had surrendered. If the entire Japanese military had been ordered to keep going that way, they would have. There is no such thing as a decisive military victory in a war. All wars end in negotiated settlements, either explicit or tacit, where the side we decide to call defeated makes a decision that they would rather stop fighting and accept what's on offer, rather than keep fighting and hold out for something better. See, there's no such thing as decisive military victory. What would have been the right thing to do in Afghanistan? Well, in my view, it was negotiate way earlier than this. If you look back at the long, tortured 20-year history of this war, the best opportunity for getting what was to understand as a successful outcome of victory in Afghanistan was back in 2002. Right, in 2002, the Taliban had been thrown out of the country. Their military had essentially been destroyed. Right, lots of soldiers still out there, but not in organized formations. They didn't have any tanks. They didn't have a government telling them what to do. The Taliban was scattered and had fled into Pakistan. And we then convened a big negotiation in Bonn to decide what is the future Afghan government going to look like. The Taliban were excluded from these negotiations. They were made illegal, and they were given no role in the future government, and they had no say in the talks about what that government would look like. At that point, when our leverage was at its peak, our influence was at its highest. If we had instead said to the Taliban, "You're a good cause," you Taliban don't know who calls this. Trust us, he's an important, different Russian guy. Let's all be good cause citizens, and we will entertain representation from your side in these talks, and we're open to some legal political entity representing you and your interests. You are not going to run the country. Right? You lost the right to do that by performing so badly militarily the last 6-ish months. But we are open to discussing some role for you as one among a variety of actors in a politically pluralistic Afghanistan. But you're going to have to compete for office in a political process. You may or may not have any guaranteed withhold of ministries or parliamentary seats or anything else. But let's talk. The deal we could have gotten then would be vastly better than the best possible deal we could get right now. If the administration had done what I prefer rather than what they chose, and they kept going with the talks, and they kept the U.S. troop presence in the country and pursued the best possible negotiation, the compromise we would have reached with the Taliban would have been much less favorable to us than it could have been if it had been negotiated in 2002. In 2002, we weren't interested. We just wanted decisive military victory out of it. We're the winners. Winners get to dictate the terms. Dictate the terms, not negotiate, dictate. So that's what we tried to do. Didn't work out so well. Arguably, the same thing applies in Iraq. Right, in 2003, after Saddam was toppled and the Ba'athist military was dispersed, if instead of debathification and declaring the former government illegal and refusing to pay any of its representatives, we had negotiated a settlement then, there's some case to be made that we could have averted the subsequent unpleasantness and gotten an outcome that wouldn't have looked radically different than what we got afterwards. I think the moral of the story, right, the message, one of several messages to be drawn from 20 years of grinding, frustrating, bloody, destructive warfare in Afghanistan is we would be all much better served to ditch this idea that the right way for the United States to use its military power is wage decisive wars for military victories, and instead understand war as a means to political ends that are normally accomplished through some process of negotiation. and recognize that negotiation is weakness. Negotiation is how you win a war. And change the way we think about this going forward. Let me just throw in one other message that I draw for 20 years for Paul's frustration of throwing the Q&A, which is the United States typically performs well militarily at a tactical level and horribly at the strategic and grand strategic level. And Afghanistan is a case in point for this. The war in Afghanistan is sort of ping-pong back and forth between reinforcement and disengagement. Reinforcement and disengagement. And if you conceive of the purpose of war the way I just did a minute ago, right? It's a process, a violent process for achieving a political end, usually through negotiation. What you want is some degree of consistency in the way you approach the problem. Our policy in Afghanistan has been anything but consistent. And part of the reason for this is increasingly the U.S. military is a politicized institution. And that has made cooperation with the civilians who are responsible for the ultimate decisions about waging the war increasingly difficult. Because what is increasingly happening is that the elected political officials in Washington view the U.S. military not as a member of a team, not as somebody who's on your side and helping bring about an outcome that all Americans will see as beneficial, but as a hostile political constituency. Democrats think they're all Republicans, and if you don't, give them what they want, they'll leak to the press, and they'll oppose you in the public square, and they'll undermine your ability to achieve what you want politically. The Trump administration also viewed the military either as political pawns and tools, or as potential political opponents who were going to leak to the press if they didn't like what the Trump administration was saying. So the Trump administration came into office basically hating the war in Afghanistan. By all accounts, the instincts of Donald J. Trump as a political figure are kind of quasi-isolationist. He doesn't like forever wars. He wanted out of it. So what's the first decision he makes about Afghanistan? Is it to say, all right, I don't like forever wars. I don't think it's worth it. I'm just going home. No, he reinforces. Donald Trump's first decision about Afghanistan was to send more troops. Why did he send more troops when this is counter to every instinct the man apparently holds about Afghanistan? Well, it was because that's what the military wanted. I think he was increasingly worried that if he didn't kowtow to the military preference on the war, the military would go to the press and say mean, nasty things about Donald J. Trump, and therefore he gave them what they wanted for a while until the frustration finally boiled over. And he changed his mind and went from reinforcement to withdrawal and negotiated this, in my view, rather misbegotten bilateral arrangement with Taliban for total withdrawal by day one. These are all bad ways to run a railroad. If the military and the civilian government view each other as hostile political opponents, you're going to get these kinds of ping-pong strategy making, where we end up killing a lot of people, destroying a lot of capital, spending a lot of money that could be spent on improving human well-being, on military adventures that are going to work out badly. And what this requires is a lot more discipline on all parts for how we deal with the military in the American public square. It means Democrats and Republicans have to stop using the military as political props. Let's stop having speeches at military bases with presidents in front of rows and rows of adoring soldiers and huge American flags. Right? Whatever party you represent, let's knock that off. Whatever party you represent, let's stop getting endorsements from active and retired military officers. Because what all of this does is it encourages, A, other political leaders to fear and distrust people in the uniforms because they don't want them doing that on behalf of your political opponent in the next election. And B, it means that the military increasingly sees itself as a constituency. So just a word before Q&A on the tortured Obama administration decision-making process in Afghanistan. So the now President Biden, then Vice President Biden, wanted a minimum footprint of U.S. posture in Afghanistan that would be oriented towards hunting terrorists and sustaining that. I thought that was a bad idea at the time. But that's what he wanted. David Petraeus, Admiral Mullen, and Defense Secretary Gates thought that was a terrible idea, which it was. But as a result, they refused to staff out. They would not provide a fully articulated plan for a counterterrorism posture in Afghanistan because they thought it was a terrible idea and they were afraid if they produced a fully staffed out plan, it might get chosen. The best way to prevent this, civilian elected official group from choosing badly is don't give them any bad options. Horrible idea. The Obama administration immediately understood this media would be box, that they weren't going to get to make the decision. The military was insisting on making the decision itself. And this contributed to this kind of poisonous civil-military relationship that has contributed to all these ping-ponging back and forth policies in Afghanistan. They'll left us where we are now, we're all likely to, we're going to get the worst case after spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in the process. It's very important looking forward that we all think hard about the politicization of the U.S. military. Now, we'll talk more about the state of American democracy and perhaps the role of the armed forces in the state of American democracy next week. But set aside these larger questions of future democracy, all you care about is the waging war in places like Afghanistan and perhaps others in the future. We need to worry about the political involvement of the military and the way both senior civilians and senior military increasingly understand their relationship with each other. We need to get the military out of American politics, where it has been rather too selfish. Why don't I stop and go to Q&A?
Sure, that sounds great. Why don't we give Steve a round of applause first? Anyone has a question, and Steve, you may want to repeat it for the Zoom audience.
Good point.
Yeah, that is the military reaction. Wait.
I'm sorry.
How did the military react? Donald Trump wanted to have a big military parade.
The military. Oh, yeah, the question was, which I didn't initially hear. How did the military respond when Donald Trump wanted a big military parade? The military liked certain elements of Trumpism and really hated other elements, and the parade is one of them. Every military officer I've spoken to about this, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary of Defense at the time, said things along the lines of military parades are what you expect in Moscow. Right? That's what autocrats do. They have these big military parades and they show off all their military equipment, and that's not what we Americans do. Right? So the military hated the idea, partly because they associate this with kind of tin pot dictator kinds of behaviors, and partly because it's expensive and they'd rather spend money on other things. Especially if you do it the way Trump wanted to do it, and you drive tanks down Independence Avenue. That would tear up Independence Avenue. So for all sorts of reasons, the military wanted no part of the military parade and dragged their feet on it. But this gets back to the question of politicization of the military, right? As I think you folks know, I was not a Donald Trump supporter, nor am I. Yeah, I know you're shocked. I don't normally take partisan positions in sets like this, so I think I've already done it on this one, so I'm not breaking it down. the military attitude towards Trump was complicated, right? But the significant part of it was disliking the way they were being used politically. And if you want the military out of politics, which I do, that means not just you want the military opposing Trump policies that you don't like or favoring Trump. And frankly, I would have preferred, I thought the military parade was a terrible idea. I would have preferred that the military salute and execute if that's what they're being ordered to do. But this gets back to what politicization of the military really means, right? But the problem is most of us understand politicization of the military. The military needs to stop supporting political actors I don't like. Well, they should also stop supporting political actors I do like. Right? I didn't want the military parade, but the right thing to do would have been for the military to salute and do the darn parade. Right? Yeah. Depoliticizing the military means we all take a hit to something we like. And that's actually a particularly good example. The military dragged their feet, refused to organize the thing, refused to staff it out, refused to plan it, and it didn't eventually happen because Donald Trump's attention span is about that big, right? And so, pardon my occasional act of partisanship, but the result is you can drag your feet and you can eventually get the political outcome you want with that administration, and that's what they did. And in my view, it was a mistake to do that. The parade would have been a mistake, but it was also a mistake for the military to drag their feet that way. Now, the more challenging issue comes if Trump had refused to leave office right after the election. And then you get to issues of the role of security forces generally that become transcendent in historically unprecedented ways. And if you really wanted to push the issue of American civil-military relations hard to its limits, the most dangerous civil-military issue confronting America in the last 200 years, arguably, has been what would have happened if the Republican Party had chosen somewhat different, right, in December and January. Does the military then have a transcendent responsibility to the nation that goes beyond their legal responsibility to commander-in-chief? That's a very, very tough question. But when it comes to things like military parades, things like the defense budget, things like troops in Afghanistan, my own view is I want, and I think the American military needs to staff out even options that I don't like. Because I think that's the only way that both parties eventually stop treating these hostile constituencies. Yeah.
I have a question about, you said about collapse, right? You fear collapse. And there's two things that I really fear in collapse. One is well, and the other interesting to society, we say 20 years, right? I see it more like 40 years, right? Because we've been there since the 80s, right? When we were providing arms to the Afghan rebels, right? Because we took the policy of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So because that was anti-Russia. So the question is, if there's collapse, do you fear Russia moves in, one? And two, do you fear that makes the other reason we did that back then and still have been there, I think, today, is a broader war on drugs, right? The two words you didn't say today yet were opium and Russia. And that's the core of my question, I guess, is one, do you fear Russia? Do you fear opium comes in?
Yeah, the question is, if in fact the Afghan government collapses, will Russia end up back in Afghanistan, and what will happen to the opium trade from global narcotics trafficking? Russia is in Afghanistan now. Right? One of the problems with the war as it's ground on is that each of the neighbors are increasingly engaged in what's going on in the country out of self-defense, because they're all increasingly, in view, sensible enough, in my opinion, the American project is ending in failure, and they need to act to protect their self-interest in the country. So Russian intelligence is apparently operating in the country. There was brief news coverage a year or so ago to Russian intelligence paying bounties to the Taliban for killing American troops. So there's increasing involvement by the Iranians, by the Russians, much less with some from the Chinese, obviously from the Pakistanis, and there has been all along. The conflicts like this suck in the neighbors. I mean, my main argument about the hard U.S. national security interests involved in the country is largely about what it does for the neighborhood. Right? So the neighbors will certainly be involved. I don't think that's going to produce a Russian takeover of Afghanistan. The whole problem is I don't think it's going to produce a takeover by anybody, including the Taliban. I think far more likely than a takeover by somebody is long-term chronic civil warfare among probably dozens of different factions and actors, in which the Taliban themselves are likely to split. The Taliban are a collection of factions. The ability of those factions to continue working together is going to be tested as the Afghan government conflicts. So anyway, I think the Russians will be funding their preferred proxies, which is the way most of the neighbors are going to respond to this. And the funding level for proxies will be quite high, including by the Indians. And that's part of the reason why I don't think the Taliban are going to simply try. There are too many other armed actors in the country. The Taliban themselves are too disunified. So I don't think there will be a state visit by Putin to a satellite government in Kabul anytime soon. But neither will that be the case for Pakistani government or the Iranian government or anybody else. So that is the question of narcotics. Some of the Allied actors in Afghanistan have heavily emphasized the counter-narcotics mission when justifying the presence of the British in particular. Have long made the argument that they're in Afghanistan in large part to solve the drug problem. But when you talk about ping-ponging policies in Afghanistan, number one on my list of case examples would be counter-narcotics policy. Right? We've gone from heavy emphasis on counter-narcotics with an emphasis on destroying the poppy fields to deciding that counter-narcotics is a third-order problem we're not going to worry about at all, to attempting to create alternative crops as options for Afghan farmers, to trying to punish the mostly Taliban smuggling network for getting opium out of the fields and into the international market as a way of dealing with the problem of hurting farmers. Back, forward, back, we've been all over the place. And none of these policies have done much. And part of the reason they haven't done much is because at the end of the day, the narcotics problem in Afghanistan is a symptom of the war. At various times, we, like the British, have decided it's causes the war, and therefore, if we can solve the opium problem, we'll cut off the Taliban's funding through the sale of opium, and that will weaken the Taliban and enable us to win the war. It turns out the Taliban funding stream is not central for opium. They have a lot of other ways of getting money. Opium is not a primary one. And opium is a significant part of the Afghan economy. Therefore, anything you do to diminish his trade impoverishes farmers. It turns out the opium fields are disproportionately located in places where the Taliban is the strongest. That's not wholly accidental, right? Opium isn't their primary funding stream, but it is a contributor to their funding stream, and therefore they invest heavily in places like the Central Holland River Valley, which is a particularly fertile opium growing area. So when you do anything you do to try and diminish the global value of Afghanistan's contribution to the opium trade is sooner or later going to disadvantage the farmers who grow the power. And when you do that, you strengthen local support for Taliban in those areas. A. B, your ability to really strongly affect global narcotics outcomes from Afghanistan requires an ability to establish political control in these places and political control of the supply lines to take the opium out of the country. If you can't do that, it's going to be very hard to prevent farmers from growing this. no matter how you look at it, in my view, you're not going to solve the opiate problem in Afghanistan until we get a settlement to the war. If you get a settlement to the war, then there are all sorts of avenues for dealing with this problem. Order props and aid and some combination can deal with this problem. But only once the shooting stops. Yes.
You talked about two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which we invaded. Two other wars, Kuwait and Korea. How do we deal with those?
In Kuwait and Korea, both, what you had were essentially negotiated settlements that ended the war. So let's start with Kuwait, right, in 1991. Famously, Norman Schwarzkopf sat down with Saddam Hussein's military representatives in Safwan in 1991. After we had declared a ceasefire, right, we had mostly kicked the Iraqi military out of Kuwait by brute force. Colin Powell decided that he didn't want to let this play out to total destruction of the Iraqi military, largely because it looked bad on television screens to have Americans swarming and fleeing Iraqis. So we declared a ceasefire, and then we left it up to Norman Schwarzkopf to negotiate the settlement that would end the war in literally a tent in Safwan. And he then did agree to a variety of terms that included, infamously, allowing the Iraqis to use aircraft to put down two different nascent insurgencies within Iraq. One by Iraqi Shiites in the south, one by Iraqi Kurds in the north. There were all sorts of debates afterwards about whether that political settlement was actually in U.S. interest or not. But the war in 1991 Persian Gulf didn't end with a decisive military victory in the sense that so many people imagine it either. It ended with a negotiated deal between Norman Schwarzkopf and Saddam Hussein, which could have ended differently. In fact, it was this law. My wife Tammy and I watched a year or two ago a PBS Frontline episode that was done on the 1991 Gulf War. It was done not long after the end of the war. And it was the typical kind of frontline Gestalt, right? Grim music, dark scenes, ominous voiceovers by announcers talking about how the United States didn't topple Saddam Hussein. We hung our allies up to try to solve the negotiation. It's all these. There was a standard view after 1991 among critics of war was that the politics were botched. Militarily, we ejected the Iraqi military from Kuwait at low casualties ourselves, but so the argument went, we botched the political settlement of the war, and therefore hung out to dry allies in the Shiite community and the Kurdish community within Iraq, and failed to solve the problem. Now, you can make an argument now, having seen what actually going on with toppling the Iraqi government produced, that gives you perhaps a different view on whether Schwarzkopf's negotiations at Safwan were a good thing or a bad thing. The point is there were negotiations at Safwan. Right? The war ended with a political settlement. Korea ended with, there still isn't a settlement that actually ends the war. Technically, this is a condition of war that continues between North Korea and South Korea and the United States. There's been no actual peace treaty at the end of the war. There's been an armistice, which has created a long ceasefire. But that too is essentially a decision that the two sides made voluntarily, not the result of a decisive military action that made it impossible for the other side to resist voluntarily. We didn't destroy the North Korean military, and we certainly didn't destroy the Chinese military in Korea. They continued to resist afterward. We didn't destroy their military, win decisively in imposed terms. What we got was a partly explicit and partly tacit negotiated settlement that said, we're not going to formally end the war, we're going to stop shooting at each other. But again, essentially a political negotiation, partly overt, partly tacit, not military destruction of the opponent. So I find it very hard, with the exception of the third Punic War, to think of an example where there was a true decisive military outcome of war. Now, of course, you all know. Yes, that's right. I was thinking that myself. And of course, the Romans and the Carthaginians fought a series of wars for control of the civilized world in classic antiquity. In the last of these, the Romans finally said, enough is enough. We're tired of you Carthaginians. We've had it with these periodic invasions of Italy. We are going to destroy Carthage. We're going to raise the city to the ground. We're selling every resident into slavery. And so goes the phrase, we're going to sprinkle salt over the ruins so nothing ever grows in the future. Now, that's decisive military victories. But the point is, short of that, it isn't a decisive military. Short of that, it's some voluntary decisions by both sides to stop shooting because they prefer what's on offer with the shooting stops to continuing the shooting. There aren't many third Punic War style outcomes. And certainly 1991 in the Gulf and Korea, neither one was a third Punic War, so the survivors of the slave were the small of the ruins coming out.
Steve, I'm going to ask one last question. I really appreciate your attention, this kind of move, the politics count, right? And, implicit maybe in your remarks are a critique of arrogance, moralism, and political innocence. If you push harder on the politics, and at the end of the day in warfare, unless you commit genocidal crimes, and maybe even if you do, there's governance left to happen on the ground. This is a hard lesson to learn for a superpower. But if you take the politics seriously, couldn't a realist arrive at the position that the Taliban are fundamentally a bad negotiating partner, as are, I hate to say it, the American people? That is, Donald J. Trump says one thing, Biden says another, we go back and forth. Our politics are all about we want to win, but we don't want to stay around and get a solution. The Taliban, they have their own vision of Afghanistan. So if that's the case, it makes sense to try to negotiate, knowing it's probably not going to come off. This is the Biden approach, right? And then settle for the hard work of keeping Pakistan together or something.
So Dave's question began by agreeing with me on the salience of politics, and I want to emphasize that point because he's really late. Therefore, we shall bring deal of attention on the salience of politics. It's absolutely right. And my talk to very gently challenge. That's what y'all skate over as quickly as possible. Get back to things like that. But he was arguing that if politics is important as Bill claims, channel is there any real prospect for settlement in Afghanistan politically then, given that the Taliban are such difficult negotiating partners and the Americans are such incompetent negotiating partners? Right? If our civil military relations are as problematic as I claim, and keep ping-ponging back and forth, who would want to negotiate with us? And then you have the Taliban, right? These famously reasonable, decent sorts who you can expect to engage in some sort of sustainable compromise solution in the larger public interest. And you can make a credible, defensible argument that these talks are hopeless. It's not my view, for reasons I'll explain this, but it is a defensible, honorable position to conclude that the talks in Afghanistan are hopeless. If that's your view, then we ought to stop throwing good money after bad and get all the way out of our role there.
I didn't say hopeless, right? I said unlikely to succeed.
Dave is doing a little. And Dave correctly amended my articulation of his position, saying not that the talks are hopeless, but that the talks are unlikely. Just see, but the issue has to do with your assessment of whether the expected outcome is promising enough to warrant the investment. And I can see a case either way. My own view is that there's enough promise to warrant trying, especially given the cost of time is now radically lower than it was in 2011. We're not spending $100 billion a year in Afghanistan. To keep the American troop presence there is costing us $2.5 billion. So given that, I don't go for a stay. But it is a reasonable position to say that the prospects are now negative enough that we don't think it's worth it. But if that's the case, the implication would be get all the way out. Stop funding the Afghan military. We spend $6 to $7 billion a year on the Afghan military. If all we're doing is just keeping this thing wired together with baling wire and duct tape for a little while before it collapses, we're spending money that could probably advance human thriving better in some other way. That's not the administration's position. The administration's position is we're going to continue to talk and keep spending money. We're just going to reduce our leverage to produce a favorable outcome of the talks in exchange for nothing. And hence, I don't think that position, that in many ways, that position is the worst of the options on offer square, in my view. Now, that said, again, I've said that I think there's a decent chance of success that makes it worth going. I'm happy to stick around and articulate why I think that's the case. We're over time, so I'm not going to do it in plenary session. But if anybody wants, I'm happy to talk about why I think it's worth continuing. But I do.
That's great. Thanks, Steve. Everyone. We're adjourned. Hope to see you next week for another great talk. And see you in worship.